December 3rd, 1944. The Hurricane Forest. It is bone cold, a profound, invasive chill that seems to suck the warmth directly from a marrow. The trees stand like skeletal black silhouettes, their claws raking the sky the color of dirty ash. A lethal, clinging fog hangs low, refusing to lift, transforming the dense woodland into a spectral nightmare. Somewhere in the vast distance, German artillery thumps with a heavy, steady rhythm of a giant, dying heart. Inside the cramped steel shell of an M4 Sherman tank, hidden behind the ruins of shattered brick wall, the air is thick with condensation and tension. The tank is positioned in a manner no field manual would ever sanction. Its turret is cranked 180 degrees, the muzzle of the 75mm cannon pointing backwards, trained down the road they had supposedly cleared hours earlier. Gunner Earl Bishop, his helmet brushing the cold steel ceiling, leans into the eyepiece, his breath plumes immediately fogging the glass. James Ortega, the loader, slides a fresh high-explosive round into the rack, glancing sideways at Bishop. "You're really doing the backwards thing, huh, Bish?" Ortega mutters, the sound barely audible over the idling engine. "Against Panthers?" From his perch, Lieutenant Carl Hartman, the tank commander, remains utterly still, watching Bishop S-back. He does not tolerate doubt. Hartman had spent the last week running calculations, arguing with headquarters, and risking a court-martial to implement this bizarre strategy. He was silent now, his whole body coiled, waiting for the inevitable. Then, through the swirling gray veil, a shape emerges. Not a ghost, but worse, a German Panther tank heavy lethal, its sloped armor drinking the limited light. It is flanked by two more, rolling slowly down the muddy track, like iron predators that own the forest. They are arrogant, comfortable, expecting nothing from their rearward approach. Bishop exhales slowly, his finger tightening around the firing mechanism. One shot. The 75mm round punches through the morning stillness like a whip crack, and a second later, the lead Panther erupts in a blinding geyser of fire and flying steel. The other two German tanks slam to a startled halt, their crews frozen. They weren't expecting a shot from behind a collapsed farmhouse. They weren't expecting a Sherman, and they sure as hell weren't expecting a Sherman to be sniping at long range. Inside the turret, James Ortega gasps. Lieutenant Carl Hartman slams his fist against the hatch ring. "Holy hell, Bishop." Hartman shouts, his voice raw with adrenaline. "You hit him clean." But Earl Bishop does not celebrate. He is already a blur of movement, adjusting the traverse, tracking the second tank with the cold precision of a backwoods hunter. Because this was not luck. This was brilliant, cold-blooded strategy, cooked up not in a war room, but in the mind of Lieutenant Carl Hartman. This is what happens when a commander from Kentucky rewrites the rules of armored warfare by turning his tank backwards, defying conventional doctrine, and turning a maneuverable M4 into a ghost sniper team. The brass had laughed. They said it would guarantee an immediate AR failure. They insisted it would never work. Until it did. And when the smoke finally cleared over the Hurricane Forest, the Germans weren't the only ones stunned. Before he became the man who neutralized the German column with an impossible shot, Lieutenant Carl Hartman was just another quiet officer assigned to the Armored Division. He trained at Fort Knox, but unlike his peers who relied on aggressive instinct, Hartman possessed a rare, chilling patience. While others fired on instinct, Hartman did complex ballistics and trigonometry in his head. He measured distance. He watched wind. He calculated. He was the quiet lieutenant no one expected. The summer of 1944 shattered the illusion of a swift victory. Lieutenant Carl Hartman had chased shadows until he landed in France that August. The Americans had achieved the impossible, clawing out of Normandy and driving the battered Wehrmacht eastward. The Allies were pushing toward the German border. But now came the hard part. The war descended into a brutal, grinding match fought across terrain that screamed defense. Rolling hills, dense Norman forests, and narrow, ambush-ridden roads. This was the hunting ground of the M4 Sherman. The M4 was the backbone of American armor, the great mechanical workhorse, with over 49,000 built during the conflict. Yet, the Sherman was fighting a technological mismatch. Its short-barreled 75 mm guns struggled desperately to penetrate the heavy, sloped armor of the German Panther and the formidable Tiger at combat ranges. The Sherman's own thin hide made it a magnet for enemy fire. In the bloody confrontation sweeping across France, the M4 was routinely outgunned and outmatched. The tankers had a bitter, fatalistic joke. They called their machine the Ronson, after the famous cigarette lighter, because like the Ronson, it lit up the first time every time. Still, the Sherman possessed crucial advantages: speed, mechanical resilience, and maneuverability. When used cleverly in coordinated packs, they could swarm and overwhelm the enemy. But that required tactics, and it required soldiers willing to abandon doctrine. That soldier was Lieutenant Carl Hartmann, the tank commander. After 2 months of skirmishes near Mortain, his crew had melded into a precision instrument of survival. There was Tony Vitelli, the nimble driver, James Ortega, the steady loader, and Earl Bishop, the keen-eyed gunner. The massive German counterattack, Operation Luttich, was already materializing, threatening to seize the vital bottleneck town of Avranches. Conventional wisdom, epitomized by Hartmann's predecessor, Staff Sergeant Gene Corbin, a loud Chicago native who detested theory, dictated blunt force. Corbin always stuck to the mantra Lieutenant Hartmann would later write in his air: keep it simple. Drive, shoot, survive. But survival wasn't coming from driving and shooting. It was going to come from radical, calculated surprise. One wet, humid night, while running maintenance checks, Lieutenant Hartmann drew the concept onto a dirty floor plate. What if they inverted the Sherman's tactical profile? What if, he asked, pointing, we set the Sherman up in reverse? James Ortega, the loader, laughed instantly. You mean shoot backwards, Lieutenant? No, Lieutenant Hartmann insisted, tracing the diagram. I mean, park it facing away from the road. We rotate the turret a full 180 degrees. The lower, less exposed rear deck faces the enemy. We back into a hidden position, fire a single surgical round, and then pull forward to retreat instantly, using the speed of the forward gear. We present the lowest possible silhouette, we maximize our speed for disengagement, and we strike first. Corbin stared at Lieutenant Hartmann for a long, heavy moment. He shook his head. That's the dumbest damn thing I've heard all day, Lieutenant. That's court-martial material. At first, no one took Lieutenant Hartmann seriously. The idea of turning a main battle tank into a stationary sniper rifle was met with scorn. Earl Bishop and Tony Vitelli called it hillbilly logic. They said the lieutenant was trying to fight a panther by sitting still and waiting for a target too big to miss. Corbin made his position clear. This isn't the kind of war where you get to sit back and aim pretty. You see a tiger, you shoot fast, or you're dead faster. But Lieutenant Hartmann was undeterred. He kept sketching, kept running ballistics math in his grease-stained notebook, charting elevation angles and shell trajectories, determined to prove that ingenuity could defeat armor plate. Lieutenant Carl Hartmann obsessed over the limitations of the M4 Sherman. He knew the 75mm M3 gun, even utilizing the high-velocity armor-piercing HVAP rounds, was often outmatched by German heavy armor. HVAP offered a crucial edge, penetration of up to 120mm at 500 yards, but its lethality bled away quickly across distance. Lieutenant Hartmann understood. He could not win a duel. He had to become a predator. His strategy demanded sniper precision. Choose the perfect oblique angle. Study the armor thickness at those acute angles and wait for the precise moment. He hunted for natural kill zones, narrow clearings, high ground, and tree leans where enemy armor might be forced into single file. He imagined the Sherman hidden in the woods, its turret pointed downrange like a coiled snake waiting to strike. But his radical squirrel tactics were strictly forbidden by command. The middle of November brought relentless rain. The forest floor was liquefied, mud swallowed boots whole and clung to the tracks of the tank like quicksand. The unit had endured a week of constant shelling, leaving the men cold, exhausted, and desperately frayed. Then, near the village of Vozenac, the cost of conventional tactics was paid in full. A nearby Sherman, turning a tight corner, was vaporized. A close-range shot from a hidden German panzer force ripped the turret clean off the hull. There were no remains to collect. That night, the horror solidified Lieutenant Hartman's resolve. He approached his loader, James Ortega, and pitched a private, unsanctioned test. Before dawn the next morning, using a patrol assignment as cover, Lieutenant Hartman defied his standing orders. He directed driver Tony Vitelli to bypass the usual forward position and instead pull the Sherman back, reversing it deep into a secluded patch of dense trees overlooking a small, muddy field, a funnel he suspected the Germans would use to reposition armor. For hours, nothing but the drip of water and the distant crackle of small arms fire. Then movement in the thick, rolling fog. Not tanks, but two German scout motorcycles slicing cautiously through the mist. Lieutenant Hartman, eyes pressed tight to the gun sight, tracked them through the gun sight. His gunner, Earl Bishop, held his breath, waiting for the command. Lieutenant Hartman didn't fire. The position was too valuable to reveal for scouts, but the trajectory, the angle, the perfect alignment, it was all there. The shot was absolutely guaranteed. They returned to camp without incident, but Commander Corbin was furious about the unauthorized deviation, threatening an AR and a potential court-martial, but Lieutenant Hartman merely accepted the dressing down. He knew the strategy was sound. The very next day, everything changed. A lone, elusive German Panther tank was terrorizing the sector west of Schmidt, using its superior range to fire from long distance and vanish before American units could respond. Artillery couldn't pin it down. Air support was unavailable. Frustrated, Corbin turned to Lieutenant Hartman, half joking, still convinced that squirrel tactic of yours works, Lieutenant? Lieutenant Hartman nodded, his expression grim. Then get up there and prove it. He was given one chance. Lieutenant Hartman selected a choke point near a muddy, narrow trail used to reach Schmidt. Driver Tony Vitelli maneuvered the Sherman, burying the rear into the brush. The turret rotated and pointed down the foggy lane, concealed and waiting. The fog grew heavy, suffocating visibility down to less than 100 yards. Then a low, grinding rumble, and then it appeared, the tip of the Panther's turret, slicing silently through the white vapor like the dorsal fin of a great white shark. Lieutenant Hartman didn't wait for the target to fully clear the mist. He adjusted the sight picture, exhaled slowly, and screamed the command. Gunner Earl Bishop fired. The 75 millimeters round, the high explosive shell shrieked through the towering pines and struck true. The resulting blast ripped the fog apart like lightning, an inferno of tearing metal and superheated oil. A German crewman tumbled out, already trailing smoke, before collapsing onto the frozen earth. The kill was absolute. Long range. First shot, the enemy turret slewed backward in defeat. No one laughed, and no one spoke. That single, impossible shot, executed by Lieutenant Carl Hartman, didn't just take out a Panzer. It redefined the Sherman, transforming it from a liability into a sniper rifle on treads. This was only the beginning. The darkness of the Hurtgen forest remained a killing ground. It was a meat grinder stretching across 50 square miles of dense, tangled woods near the German border, the place where American dreams of swift victory had come to die. Fog choked the ravines. Hidden mines littered the trails. Artillery fire was so constant it became the ambient sound of existence. Over 33,000 American casualties would ultimately be recorded in the Hurtgen, exceeding even the losses at the Battle of the Bulge. In November 1944, Lieutenant Carl Hartman and his crew were swallowed whole. Their orders were simple: hold the call trail and push toward the contested town of Schmidt. The road was a muddy, narrow scar winding through heavily defended ravines and hills. The enemy held the high ground. Trees were rigged with explosive booby traps. German 88 millimeters guns were precisely zeroed onto every blind curve. Somewhere out there, the remaining Panthers and Jag Panzers waited like silent steel wolves. Every corner, Lieutenant Hartman would later write in a letter home, felt like a death sentence. You didn't know if the next step would be mud or a buried mine. Their Sherman, C-113, was battered but operational. George March was tense, constantly checking maps. Loader James Ortega had stopped cracking jokes altogether. Lieutenant Carl Hartman himself grew cold, focused, and utterly silent. He wasn't paralyzed by fear. He was preparing. He understood that the success of that backward shot was not luck. He had studied the deflection, chosen the angle, and fired with ruthless intent. Now, he wanted to push the unorthodox tactic further. Not just an opportunistic ambush, but a deliberate sniper setup designed to exploit the enemy's predictable movement. His target was a bottleneck, a point where German heavy armor would be forced to slow, turn, and expose their vulnerable flanks. He found it near the ridge above the Visaway Creek, where the terrain dipped sharply, creating a deadly natural funnel. Lieutenant Hartman proposed a radical doctrine deviation, setting up C-113 in a camouflage, hull-down position near the tree-line. The turret intentionally reversed, the hull angled slightly to give maximum protection to their weaker engine armor. George Marks hesitated, exhaustion battling skepticism on his face. "This is a Sherman, Lieutenant Hartman," Marks argued, "not a damn rifle on treads." "I know," Lieutenant Hartman countered, his voice steady. "But if we try to fight them head-on, they'll slice us in half." After hours of tense discussion, George Marks reluctantly conceded. "One chance, Lieutenant. If you miss, we run. This tactic stays out of the AR." Driver Tony Vitelli guided the C-113 into position before dawn. The forest was dead silent. The only sound the distant drip of water and the occasional snap of a frozen branch. They backed C-113 into a dip behind a barrier of fallen timber. Lieutenant Carl Hartman aligned the 75mm gun toward the clearing, calculating the exact angle for the moment the enemy armor crested the hill. And then they waited. The clock of operation let its ground on. Hours bled into the dense, chemical fog settling over Mordine. Then the silence was ripped apart, not by shelling, but by a sound far more primal, a low mechanical growl, deep in the chest of the earth. The noise resolved into the grinding crunch of steel treads. One shadow became two, then three. Panthers, not scouts, but blunt, spearhead armor, exactly as Lieutenant Carl Hartman had calculated. They stalked out of the tree line like prehistoric predators. Sleek, dark, and utterly deadly. The lead tank paused, its massive turret traversing slowly, scanning the vaporous gloom. Just a handful of feet more, and the angle will be perfect, exposing the thin, vulnerable side plate. Lieutenant Hartman held his breath. His eye fused to the periscope, his hands adjusting the elevation with the unnerving precision of a surgeon operating in darkness. He barely moved his lips. "Target locked," he confirmed. He squeezed the firing mechanism. The M4 Sherman dug deep into its earthen hide, convulsed with the massive recoil. The 75mm armor-piercing round shrieked through the fog and struck the Panther's flank with a thunderous gong. Instantly, the impact point became a geyser of flame and ruptured steel. The turret soared upward, a fiery crown ripped from the chassis. Black, oily smoke shot skyward, a grim signal across the battlefield. The remaining two Panthers snapped their turrets left, frantic, searching for the impossible ghost that had struck them. But Lieutenant Hartman was already shouting, "Load!" Ortega, rapid. James Ortega, the loader, slammed the next shell into breech. Hartman adjusted the sight picture, fired again. The second shot slammed into ground just short, sending up a screen of earth and pulverized pine needles. The third Panther opened fire wildly, its shell tearing the branches overhead, but it was too late. Tony Vitelli, the driver, threw the levers. He floored the engine, yanking the Sherman out of its hiding nook and sliding it violently behind a tree-covered embankment. 2 shots fired, 1 catastrophic kill confirmed. The Panthers were now firing blindly into the chaos they could not locate. Tony Vitelli grabbed a radio mic. "HQ, we are engaged. Enemy armor repelled. 1 confirmed destroyed. Lieutenant Hartman's sniper setup is working. I repeat, working." The reply was heavy with skepticism, but it didn't matter. The enemy armor was withdrawing, broken. The shot that rang out through the fog didn't just destroy a Panther. It pulverized the deeply ingrained myth that the 75mm Sherman was useless unless attacking in a swarm. One man had just defeated 3, using a counterintuitive tactic, found in no tactical manual. The sodden forest near Mortagne, soaked in the prelude to drive toward Avranches, now bore witness to a new terror, the Sherman sniper. Word of the impossible kill spread faster than the fog could dissipate. Crewmen huddled over cold rations and forbidden cigarettes whispered the feat. Most dismissed it as dumb luck, a sheer fluke. But the kill was confirmed the next morning by reconnaissance. The burned-out wreck, turret blown clean off, a clean entry point through the side armor. Lieutenant Carl Hartmann had achieved what few in the European theater had dared to attempt. When headquarters requested an immediate air, the report was unambiguous. Lieutenant Carl Hartmann's positioning and reverse-fire technique are unorthodox, the official report stated, but undeniably effective. Permission is urgently requested to allow further testing of the reverse turret sniper tactic. No official approval arrived. None was needed. The theory had become legend. The radio silence was their authorization. Lieutenant Carl Hartmann would not wait for permission. 2 days later, the scene repeated itself near a frost-rimmed clearing. Tony Vitelli, the driver, guided their Sherman onto a narrow, overgrown logging track. The perfect choke point south of the road the Germans would inevitably use to flank the American defenses. Engine dead, turret trained, they became a sculpture of waiting steel. Just before the twilight swallowed the woods, the enemy arrived, the massive shadow of a Panzer followed by 2 lumbering half-tracks. Lieutenant Hartmann didn't wait for confirmation. Bishop, target, armor, fire. Earl Bishop, the gunner, settled his eye to the sight. The muzzle blast ripped the silence. The lead Panzer disintegrated in a violent blossoming of flame and shrapnel that scorched the surrounding pines. The half-tracks twisted and scattered. German infantry poured into the gloom like spilled oil. For the second time, Lieutenant Hartmann's tank escaped untouched. The crew was locked in. James Ortega, the loader, now the team's biggest evangelist, had christened Sherman the Silent Hunter. Other support crews, baffled by the sheer impossibility of their repeated success, began circulating rumors, demanding to know Lieutenant Hartmann's precise settings, his calculations for deflection, the specific elevation used to thread around through a screen of trees, the optimal ammunition mix. Unofficially, quietly, other tank teams began trying to replicate the maneuver. The bloody attrition of the deep woods proved one undeniable truth. Conventional brute force was a death sentence. Adaptation was survival, and Lieutenant Hartmann was adapting faster than the German High Command. But the rising legend was a double-edged sword. The enemy was not blind. They began changing their patterns, avoiding the dark tree lines, deploying reconnaissance scouts, and firing volleys of high-explosive rounds blindly into suspected ambush points. One desperate Panther even executed a counter-sniper sweep, raining his shells downrange before daring to advance. Death found them when concussive blasts landed a terrifying 20 feet away, burying the hull in rock-hard soil and shrapnel. It rattled them to the core, but it did not break them. They were not just surviving. They were rewriting the ARS of armored combat. Amid the freezing boots, the perpetually jammed radios, and the sickening stench of cordite, the quiet farm kid, the math-brain Lieutenant Carl Hartmann, was forging a new identity. He was becoming an armored sniper, a myth known by name, the man who found the perfect shot where none existed. The date was August 7, 1944. The ground shook as if the earth itself had revolted. The Germans, desperate to halt the Allied breakthrough, launched a massive armored counterattack known as Operation Luttich. Their objective was singular and vital: shatter the American lines and reach the strategic coastal city of Avranches. The storm broke near Mortagne. American infantry were crushed under a relentless barrage of artillery and pinned by dug-in machine gun fire. Panther tanks spearheaded the advance through narrow, booby-trapped roads, supported by mortars and tree-bursting shells that rained shrapnel down like steel snow. Lieutenant Hartmann's unit was assigned to hold the crumbling southern ridge. There would be no backup, no air cover, just a handful of Shermans, scattered riflemen, and the terrifying knowledge that they were the final anchor. If they lost this ridge, the entire front would collapse. The gray steel of the Sherman tank was cold against the fog of dawn at Mortagne. The air itself seemed to condense around the low stone wall that hid them, a ragged boundary line between life and sudden, agonizing death. This was the opening act of Operation Luttich, the German desperation play aimed squarely at Avranches. Lieutenant Karl Hartmann ignored the cold. He had positioned his tank, the Vanquisher, facing backward, the main road behind him. Again, the 76mm turret was reversed, aimed not where the enemy expected, but toward a muddy flank approach. Tony Vitelli, the driver, spoke first, his voice a low, tense rasp. "Lieutenant, I gotta ask. If they hit us, we've got nowhere to run. We're boxed in." Earl Bishop, the gunner, his eye pressed to the sight, nodded gravely. "It's a perfect shot for us, sir, but it's a perfect trap if we miss." Lieutenant Hartmann didn't move. He kept his binoculars trained on the swirling vapor. "We're not going to run, Vitelli. We're going to hit first, and we're going to hit them where they are softest. We surprise them now, or we break the line later." The crew settled into a chilling silence, each man preparing for the inevitability, rumbling toward them. James Ortega, the loader, double-checked his precious cargo. 2 high-velocity armor-piercing HVAP, rounds loaded first, followed by standard AP, then smoke. The ground began to vibrate, a deep, muscular tremor that meant only one thing: German heavy armor. Through the fog rolled the spearhead. 3 Panzer V Panthers, supported by close-knit infantry. Their formation was tight, professional, expecting frontal resistance. They expected a clumsy American reaction. They did not expect Lieutenant Hartmann as backward-aimed ambush from the left flank. The lead Panther, a dark behemoth, crossed into a small, temporary clearing. "Range, Bishop," Hartmann ordered. 700 yards, Lieutenant. Hold steady." The fog shifted, tearing momentarily, just long enough to grant Earl Bishop a clear silhouette. Hartmann barked a command. "Fire." The muzzle flash spat white into gray. The HVAP screamed across the distance, striking low and hard. Not the armor, but the complex mechanism of the drive sprocket. The Panther lurched, its mobility instantly severed, a monument of shattered engineering. Flames erupted from the belly, oil boiling into the air. But the second Panther was already reacting. Its massive cannon swiveled toward the sound of the explosion. A roar tore through the clearing as the German round detonated against the stone wall behind the Sherman. Debris rained down, shattering trees. The Vanquisher bucked violently. "Reload!" HVAP. Lieutenant Hartmann screamed, the adrenaline flooding his senses. James Ortega slammed the next round home with a practiced, desperate movement. "Second tank. Turret ring." Hartmann commanded. Earl Bishop ignored the tremors in his hands. Finding his target in the crosshairs, the narrow gap where the turret sat upon the hull, he fired. The round punched through the steel like a hot knife through butter. For a horrifying instant, the Panther's turret seemed to lift a full 2 feet before fire consumed the fighting compartment. The tank shuddered, then collapsed inward, its demise sudden and absolute, a dying beast sinking into the mud. Then came the third. It saw them. Its long 75mm gun began to turn, slow, deliberate, deadly. "Move. Now, Vitelli." Lieutenant Hartmann roared. Tony Vitelli floored the engine, but the tracks caught slick mud beneath the stone wall. The Sherman strained, refusing to gain traction. The turret of the third Panther locked on, the muzzle flash imminent. Then, before the German gunner could fire, a shockwave hit the Panther from the opposite direction. Boom! A round from an unseen American Sherman, drawn by the plumes of smoke and frantic radio chatter, had struck the German flank. Reinforcements had arrived. Caught in a brutal crossfire, the third Panther tried desperately to pivot, but the second shell tore into its engine bay. It exploded into a column of black smoke and twisted, showering steel. Silence. 3 Panthers destroyed. The battlefield, moment ago a vortex of hellfire, was now quiet save for the crackling of burning metal. The Vanquisher, scratched, scorched, and shaken, was still standing. As infantry pushed forward and medics moved in, Lieutenant Hartmann slumped back in the commander's seat, his hands trembling violently for the first time. "You all right, Lieutenant?" James Ortega asked, his voice hoarse. Hartmann nodded, swallowing hard. Yeah, just thinking. Thinking about what? That was the shot I was afraid of, Hartman confessed, gazing out at the ruin. The one where you realize you're already dead before you pull the trigger. But he had fired, and he had won. The theory of the flank ambush was now chilling proof. Later that day, staff officers began referring to Lieutenant Carl Hartman's unorthodox tactics as a long gun doctrine. Some wanted to write it up immediately into an AR. Others privately whispered about a potential court-martial for reckless exposure. But among the tank crews who fought, froze, and bled in the dense forest pockets around Mortain, Lieutenant Carl Hartman's name had become synonymous not just with survival, but with the ruthless, necessary courage to defy what fear demanded. The imitators were coming. The legacy was in motion, in the grinding gears of armored warfare. Trust was a fragile commodity, but legend spread like wildfire. After the agonizing, bloody breakthrough at Cumrite, crews across the 20th Armored Division began whispering about the lieutenant's method. Not simply Lieutenant Carl Hartman, but the tactic itself. It was an insult to every Sherman training manual. Standard doctrine demanded aggressive, forward momentum, charge with strength, fire, maneuver, and maintain mobility. What Lieutenant Hartman demanded felt like a slow, meticulous suicide. It was a complete reversal. Back into Sherman into position, engine idling low, the turret swiveled a full 180 degrees, transforming the tank into an immobile, concealed sniper's nest. To sit still, to turn your back on the approaching battle, felt like tempting the German 88mm gods. One misstep by driver Tony Vitelli, 1 second of delay by loader James Ortega, and an entire crew would be vaporized. Yet, the statistics defied the inherent danger. In 3 confirmed documented engagements using this inverted posture, the tank commanded by Lieutenant Hartman had destroyed 5 enemy tanks, including 2 heavy Panthers and a Panzer IV, without taking a single damaging hit to the hull. Gunner Earl Bishop wasn't engaging in tank warfare. He was executing surgical precision kills. The high brass, initially dismissive, were now scrambling, demanding answers in detailed ARS. The long mock Sherman, often derided as the Ronson lighter for its tendency to burn, was suddenly outperforming every expectation. Could a lighter, faster tank, paired with the lethal patience of Lieutenant Hartman, truly shift the balance of power? Could a single man, thinking less like a charging tanker and more like an invisible sniper, redefine how the war was fought in these treacherous forests? Lieutenant Hartman ignored the doctrinal debate. His focus remained ruthlessly simple: the lives of his men, and the conservation of ordnance. He told a junior commander one night, the cold stew steaming faintly, "You don't fire unless you're certain of the kill. Every shell costs more than just metal. It costs silence. It costs time. It costs your position." Other tankers reacted by instinct, Lieutenant Hartman thought. But fame bred immediate friction. At a divisional briefing, Senior Officer Colonel Bennett scoffed openly. "Turning your turret backwards is a great way to die looking the wrong way. This war is about mobility, not hiding like a coward in the brush." The accusation hung heavy. Lieutenant Hartman, unwavering, replied quietly, "With all due respect, sir, cowards don't sit motionless when Panthers roll into their field of view." A silence fell, heavier than tank armor. Lieutenant Corbin and 2 other tank commanders who had witnessed the kills backed him instantly. The alternative was too high a price in lost material and dead men, risking a future court-martial over failed missions. Slowly, piece by painstaking piece, the brass began to allow for situational flexibility, drafting unofficial guidelines that greenlit the tactic Lieutenant Hartman had perfected. By late summer, as the German forces prepared for the massive counterblow of Operation Luttich aimed squarely at Avranches, at least 4 other crews were using modified versions of the reverse sniper setup. One crew, ambushed in the broken fields west of Mortain, credited the method with saving their lives. Using the wreckage of a collapsed barn for concealment, they reversed their position, waited, and executed a Jagdpanzer as it stalked past. Unofficial and dangerous, they called the maneuver the Victory Special. But for Lieutenant Carl Hartman, recognition meant nothing. He still meticulously cleaned his cannon barrel by hand every night. He still tracked every shot, every angle, every kill in a battered, oil-stained notebook. Every new position was studied like a chessboard. Fields of fire, blind spots, escape routes. Because in the war of attrition, precision was the only path to survival. Lieutenant Carl Hartman had become more than a tank commander. He was a battlefield architect. He transformed the raw skill of his gunner, Earl Bishop, into a devastating instrument of war. In a conflict where survival was measured in the microscopic tolerances of armor and the milliseconds of a shell trajectory, this synergy made them lethally effective, not just against the enemy, but against entrenched military doctrine. The boy from Kentucky wasn't just destroying tanks. He was changing the geometry of American armor tactics. The cost of such innovation, however, was immense. December arrived like a physical blow. Snow choked the forest lines leading toward the historic push at Avranches. The cold wasn't just physical. It was a spiritual drain. Morale plummeted. The earth, softened by endless rain, now froze into jagged, razor-sharp ice. Frostbite claimed men silently in the night. Even the formidable German Panthers began to stall, betrayed by catastrophic engine failures in the sub-zero temperatures. Lieutenant Hartman Sherman, C-113, was a testament to survival, covered in dense soot and the smoke stains of 24 battles. They never cleaned it. Its scars became a silent promise. Hartman changed, too. He barely registered the whistle of incoming fire and didn't flinch when shrapnel tore through nearby pines. But what shook him, what burrowed deep into his memory, was the deadly, absolute silence that followed Earl Bishop's perfect shot. It was a knowing, the split second between the kill and the next breath, when he realized another crew, men just like his, would never climb out of that burning metal box. "I don't know how to feel anymore," he wrote home. "Every shot I make saves us, but every shot I make also means someone else's son doesn't go home. Sometimes I can still see the hatch opening just before the fire catches." Loader James Ortega, usually the company joker, stopped talking altogether. Driver Tony Vitelli grew fiercely protective, refusing to take unnecessary risks. Hartman taped a photo above the rangefinder. His younger sister, Leah, 8 years old, hair in braids, smiling in front of the familiar Kentucky tractor. "Something to remind me what I'm shooting for," he muttered. He never stopped adapting. In a sharp engagement near the town of Bergstein, Hartman ordered Tony Vitelli to position the Sherman on a treacherous, snow-slick slope. It was a revolutionary move, using elevation for a downward shot. An unsuspecting Tiger tank approached from the road below. Earl Bishop delivered the high-angle round. It pierced the thinly armored engine plate. One shot, one kill. It wasn't arrogance. It was absolute necessity. The brass had stopped questioning his methods after reviewing the initial ARS. In fact, they began quietly assigning Lieutenant Hartman's crew to forward observation roles, not to scout terrain, but to design intricate kill zones tailored precisely for his sniper tactics. But Hartman still saw himself as nothing more than a lucky farm kid trying desperately not to get his friends killed. One night, after their 20th mission, driver Tony Vitelli looked across the cramped interior. "What happens when this war is over, Lieutenant?" Vitelli asked. Hartman looked down at his hands, calloused and scorched in places from hot shell casings. "I guess I go home," he said. "Fix tractors again. Maybe teach my sister how to drive." The silence that followed was profound. Not the quiet of peacetime, but the deep, heavy stillness that settles after an artillery barrage has passed, a silence saturated with smoke and memory. In that echoing steel box, there was only the ghost wind sighing through the shattered branches of the Hyrcan forest, and the impossible recollection of a boy who had rewritten the geometry of war. He hadn't fought to be a hero. He fought to bring his brothers home. He was the anomaly, the man who sniped with a 75mm gun. When the last snow finally surrendered to the spring thaw, the forest floor revealed more than just shell craters and mangled steel husks. It revealed the ruins of a rigid doctrine, shattered not by superior firepower, but by superior thought. Among those ghosts stood the legacy of Harlan Vickery. He wielded no command, earned no medal for strategy, and held no rank that inspired salute. But he possessed something far rarer than authority, a mind that simply refused to accept the standard operating procedure. The official AARS would never speak his name. They utilized the sterile, cold language of the headquarters, innovative turret positioning, nonlinear tank deployment, asymmetric armor utilization. But the crews who drove home, who walked away alive, cared nothing for that clinical lexicon. They had a simpler summary. Harlan showed us how to fight smarter. By the grim grip of early January 1945, Vickery's tactics had spread far beyond rumor. Whisper campaigns turned into quiet instruction. Commanders, desperate for an edge, told crews to scout like snipers, to treat the terrain as true cover and to hold fire, to fire not first, but best. Yet Harlan Vickery was not there to witness the change he wrought. After a third near miss, a blast so close it vaporized a crew the Sherman parked inches from his flank, he requested rotation out. It was not cowardice. It was completion. He had proven his theorem. He had bled the lesson into the earth. And so they let him go. When he stepped off the train in rural Kentucky in the spring of '45, there was no brass band, no salute, no cheering column of men. His little sister ran up and hugged his knees. His father simply handed him a heavy wrench. His mother set a fourth plate at the dinner table. That, Harlan always maintained, was the only welcome that ever mattered. He never leveraged his battlefield fame. He never wrote a book, never claimed the title of tank sniper. But if you drove by his mantelpiece years later, you might have noticed a heavy, inert shell casing, polished smooth, empty, harmless. If you asked about it, he would offer a faint smile, heavy with history. That, he would say, is the one that let me come home. It is too easy, in the harsh glare of hindsight, to reduce war to statistics. Tanks built, cities leveled, battles won. But stories like Harlan Vickery's serve as a bitter reminder that war is not about volume. It is about quiet, calculated decisions, micro risks taken by men no one notices until it is too late to forget them. Harlan won, not through brute firepower, but through a radical refusal to accept the obvious. He asked the impossible question, the one no one else had the courage or foolishness to utter. What if I turned the turret around? And in that question lived the seed of everything that followed. Minds changed, lives saved, and a new way of thinking born not from a textbook, but from the desperate, ingenious gut of a scared young man trapped in a steel box. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of soldiers like him. Not the number of targets destroyed, but the number of lives that didn't have to die, all because one man decided to look at the battlefield backwards.